Hello and welcome to our weekly dive into all things Ukraine with our defence and security analyst, Michael Clarke. Michael, this could of course be a pivotal week for Ukraine. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin meeting in Alaska on Friday. Hundreds of you have sent in your questions on the Ukraine blog. You can scan the QR code on your screen if you want to join in that live as well. So let's dive straight in, Michael. The last 24, 48 hours have been really interesting, haven't they? Russia's been on the attack. Amy's got a question. She wants to know what your thoughts are on Russia's recent surprise attack, and what do we know from the ground, and does it have any significance?
Yeah, I mean, there is something going on, Jane. The Russians launched some sort of surprise attack about 72 hours ago now, and they're trying to push northwards on the road that goes between essentially Pokrovsk and Dobrokivka, right through to Kramatorsk. And Kramatorsk is the key city in the Donbass. If the Russians get Kramatorsk, basically they get the Donbass. Now, they're quite a long way away from that, but they're trying to push north in a surprise attack. It's not a very heavy attack. What they've done is it's known as dismounted infantry. So they've used small groups of soldiers, some of them on bikes and motorbikes, and some of them on foot. And they've pushed as far forward as they can in small units. If they can, and they've got quite a long way forward, I mean, about 15 or 20 kilometres, which is a long way in terms of this war, the way it's gone in the last couple of years. If they can reinforce those positions, then they really could be in a position to threaten these big defensive positions which the Ukrainians have got in that area. The Ukrainians undoubtedly are trying to resist it. And my latest information is the Ukrainians have put in their 33rd Brigade and some brigades from their new Azov Corps. They've created a new corps, which normally has 4 or 5 brigades. They're using at least 1 or 2 of those. So I think the Ukrainians are rushing reserves in to block this. But it's quite a big battle that's going on between now and sometime next week. But it's obviously designed to change the facts on the ground before this meeting in Alaska. Because if Putin can say, look, I'm about to get the Donbass anyway, we're launching an offensive which will give me the Donbass in another month. So why not take it now and prevent all the killing? It's designed to give him that sort of argument. And of course, the Ukrainians are determined that that won't be the argument in Alaska, and that they can show, they hope to be able to show, that the Russians aren't going to get very far with this.
So that sort of takes us into James's question. Do you think that the attack was, from Russia's move, opportunistic or strategic? And it sounds like you think it was strategic.
It was strategic. It was opportunistic in the sense that they were probing for sort of holes in the defence, and they found quite a lot of holes. I mean, one of the things that's coming through from this is that the Ukrainians are not particularly well organised in that area. A lot of their units are under strength, and they're not terribly well organised for defence. For instance, there's all sorts of stories that instead of having 3 lines of trenches, which they should have had, they only had 1 line, so nothing to fall back into when forward trenches get attacked. And that's a very old military maxim, goes back to the First World War. If you're going to dig trenches, do 3 lines of everything, a good few hundred yards behind each other. So that's come out. But undoubtedly the Russians are probing, but there is a strategic intent behind this. And they've moved forward. I say Dobropilya. I think I said Dobrokivka before. I'm sorry, it was a different place. They've moved north of Dobropilya, or up to Dobropilya, somewhere to the east of that. And there are 2 lines of thrust which look as if they might be able to close or interfere with this main highway to Kramatorsk. And that's the objective, get hold of the highway and cut off Kramatorsk from the area around Pokrovsk and further south.
How close to where Russia would like to be are these lines as well? If they're thinking that they're going to fight to get the Donbass in this talk on Friday, that's what Russia potentially may want. From what they've taken so far, how much more of it would?
Well, it's not that much of the Donbass still to get. It's 25 or 30%. But what they're trying to do is to take the most heavily fortified part of it. If you think of a sort of line of cities from the north to the south of the Ukrainian-held part of the Donbass, so Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, coming south, then to Kostiantynivka, and then to Druzhkivka. And those 4 cities and all the villages in between are really quite heavily defended. The Russians call them the fortress cities. and they're in a good geographical position. And the Ukrainians really want to hang on to them, because if the Russians get those areas, if they're given those areas as a result of something that happens in Ankara, then the Ukrainians have lost their main defensive line in the Donbass. And if they fall back westwards, away from that line, it'll be a long way, they have to go a long way west before they can dig in again in anywhere so advantageous. So the Ukrainians are absolutely committed to trying to keep their fortress cities intact. And although the Russians aren't very far away from them, I mean, in the north, for instance, Slavyansk, I mean, the Russians are at Lyman. I mean, that's only sort of 8 or 9 miles away from Slavyansk. That's pretty close. But in military terms, it's a long way, because it's like attacking the walls of a fortress. It's not as if they can sweep through these cities. If they move northwards quickly, I don't think they can, but if they were to move northwards really quickly, they then have to lay siege to each of these in turn. And we know what Russian sieges are like, going back to Mariupol and Bakhmut and Avdiivka. It's months and months of artillery until they end up taking control of the rubble.
Yeah, exactly. There'll be nothing left for them to take, virtually. Yeah. It'll be pretty flattened.
So, I mean, bottom line is they're not far away geographically, but they're quite a long way militarily from taking control of the Donbass, unless it is handed to them in some sort of deal that's done in Anchorage.
So in terms of what's happening in Anchorage, let's look at this meeting on Friday, just between Trump and Putin as we speak. Obviously, Zelenskyy wants to be there, but, it doesn't seem that he's going to be. Graham's asked a question about what territorial prizes will Putin be after in any agreement. And I guess we've sort of covered that, really.
That's what he said, the Donbass.
It is the Donbass, isn't it?
There may be other things they talk about, but Putin seems to have said to the Americans, according to the Americans, I mean, the Russians aren't saying anything much in public, but the Americans are saying that what they're getting from the Russians is that the Donbass is an absolute demand. Before we can talk about a ceasefire, says Putin, I have to have the Donbass. Then we can talk about a ceasefire, is what he seems to be saying. And Zelensky's saying, well, don't even think about it. We're not going to give you the Donbass.
Declan says, what would a land exchange look like in practice? And is there any historical precedent?
Yeah, there are actually, although in different circumstances. Some interesting precedents, I think. I mean, one of them was the famous Oder-Neisse line. 1990, Germany and Poland, when the Cold War came to an end, they settled a line that had been a bone of contention all the way through the Cold War, which is the boundary between Germany and Poland. And it was the Oder-Neisse line, the river line, and that was settled with a transfer of territory and legal sovereignty either way. Let's see, that Russia and China had a deal in 2004, I think it was, to settle some outstanding territorial disputes in the Far East on the Ussuri River, or near the Ussuri River, where their border is a bit ambiguous. There was a very good case in the most recent case I can think of was 2011. The South Sudan, it's the most recent state in the world, the newest country to be created in the world in 2011, carved out of Sudan. And as a result of that deal, Sudan and South Sudan exchanged some territory formally. So it does happen. The difference is that in those cases, territory was being formally exchanged as a result of a peace deal that was already agreed. And so it was a way of getting some of the irritations out of the way. And even, actually now I remember, Israel and Egypt exchanged territory in 1979 as a result of a peace deal that they had done. So it can happen. But the difference here is that we'd be talking about exchanging territory before a peace deal is done, when one side absolutely doesn't want to exchange it. And remember, what is being exchanged is Ukrainian territory for other Ukrainian territory. I mean, all of this territory belongs to Ukraine.
It's not an exchange, really, is it?
Exactly. They're being, they're being sort of charged their own money, as it were. So, I mean, these territorial swaps that Trump is talking about would be inherently unstable politically, because they're not as a result of a peace deal where everybody wants to clear the decks of irritating problems. They would be imposed on one side in favour of the other, who's carrying on a war of aggression against Ukraine. So, but yes, there are historical precedents. It does happen, but usually as a way of getting rid of irritations when there is a peace already established.
And usually involving the countries
involving
themselves.
Whose territory it is.
Whose territory it is, talking about
point.
it. Yeah, it is, it is. So Franklin asks about this meeting on Friday. Putin's travelling to Alaska. He says it seems to be quite a turnaround from Russia. Why do you think Russia is suddenly willing to engage? And does the US have some leverage after Trump's tariffs on Russia's trading partners?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, actually. I mean, the point is, I think Putin must have known when Trump said, there'll be strong sanctions unless you agree a ceasefire, and I'll give you 60 days to make your minds up before the sanctions come into force. Then he changed that to say you'll do it within 2 weeks, and that was last Friday. That deadline came and went. And so the Russians needed to do something, not just sit there and throw the ball entirely back into the White House's court. And so what they did is they talked about, well, maybe we can have a meeting. And astonishingly, the White House agreed to it, because this, instead of pressure on Putin, it's now become a diplomatic triumph for Putin to be invited to a summit on American territory. And this, remember, Putin is a pariah in most of world politics still. He's an indicted war criminal at the ICC, and he's being hosted with full diplomatic honours on US territory. I mean, that's a huge win for him, and he's given nothing for it, absolutely nothing. But it is a good question. I mean, why were the Russians prepared to come to this? He's always wanted a one-to-one summit with Trump. In the second Trump term, his ambition is always a one-to-one summit. You and me, the two big leaders, and we can do a strategic deal. Russia and America have got lots of common interests, not least economic interests in the Arctic. We shouldn't allow this Ukraine war to get in the way. And his message, Putin's message to Trump and to America is, look, leave Ukraine to me. It doesn't matter to you. Leave it to me, and we'll get on with the bigger things that you and I can do together. And that's, at the moment, that's the narrative which Trump looks as if he's going along with. He may not. He's very unpredictable. But at the moment, that seems to be the narrative which is going to dominate this summit. And remember, this summit, it's not going to be a sort of a wet towel over the head for 15 hours and no sleep. It's not going to be like an EU summit, which goes on all night, and they stop the clock at 1 minute to midnight in order for it to go on another 5 or 6 hours and still take place on the day it's supposed to take place. This summit is going to be less than 2 hours. It's probably going to be an hour between the two leaders. I mean, goodness knows what they can agree in an hour working through an interpreter.
Yeah, because the last meeting we had with Witkoff was like 3 hours, wasn't it? Yes, it seems to have gone forever.
Yes. And Witkoff, according to the Europeans, the European leaders are very sceptical about Witkoff. He said he doesn't seem to have understood what he was being told. He's come back with different versions of what the Russian position is. And he doesn't seem to understand the geography very well. They're being quite rude about him, because they're saying he seems to be completely out of his depth. And if you sit, opposite a leader with only an interpreter in the room and no proper notes taken, that is bound to happen. And I'm sure Steve Witkoff is a good property developer. One imagines he's pretty good at golf, but I don't think he's very good. It's not very good. I mean, in the world of global politics, I think he's a complete innocent.
And Trump is somebody who's not only wily, but has got all those years of experience under his belt.
Putin, yeah.
Putin, sorry.
Absolutely, yeah. Putin, the old KGB man. And I mean, Putin, as we say, he's been living with the Ukraine issue for 20-odd years, and he knows it all. And so he's able to work with any bit of detail. You give him a bit of detail, and he'll give people a lecture on it. Most times he lectures people going back to the 13th and 12th centuries. And it's on the history of Ukraine. It's all rubbish history, incidentally. I mean, I've read some of the things he's written about Ukraine. It's absolute rubbish as history, but he believes it, and he backs it up with other historical facts, which other people at the table can't contradict because they don't know. And so Putin is quite impressive on this, apparently. Well, I've never spoken to him personally, but people I know who have, they say, when he gets going, it's like a sort of steamroller of historical stuff that he throws at everybody.
Alternative facts. No wonder he gets on with Trump so well.
Absolutely. Yeah, they live in their own realities. Both these leaders live in their own realities.
We've had a question just come in just now from Anthony B. He says, if a new border is formed between Ukraine and Russia, has Trump ever said how it should be policed?
No.
Or is he not bothered?
No, and that's one of the things that Zelenskyy has said. He said, if there is a deal that we agree to, what are the security guarantees? What guarantees can there be that this will be the end of it, at least for the next 20 or 30 years? And of course, nobody trusts Putin because he's broken literally every single international agreement that Russia has entered into since 1999, when he became prime minister in the first instance. He's broken every single one of them. So what guarantees are there? And what Zelenskyy says, well, the only real guarantee is NATO membership, and that is effectively off the table for all sorts of reasons, which we've dealt with before, and we don't need to go into, I suspect. And what the Americans are saying, I mean, Trump has always been vague about this, security guarantees, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. We'll get a deal. And look, we've got the minerals deal. So we've got a deal to excavate minerals and share the profits between America and America and Ukraine. And that means that American contractors will be in Ukraine, and that will be a guarantee. There'll be American companies operating in Ukraine. I mean, that is pie in the sky, because this minerals deal isn't going to start to pay off for at least a decade. And I can promise you that big companies do not invest in war zones. They don't invest in countries that may fall into a state of war. I mean, some companies always do because they can make a quick profit. But the big companies stay away from war zones. So this minerals deal is a shadow of a security guarantee. And the Americans have never come up with any alternative ideas. And even the people who are thinking more carefully about this, like Keith Kellogg, who's pretty good, Fred Fleitz, who's been interviewed a lot these days, who wrote this paper with Keith Kellogg before Christmas about what a deal might look like. And these are kind of sensible people. And Keith Kellogg's a good old military man. Actually, Keith Kellogg, he's a paratrooper, right? An ex-paratrooper. So is his wife, and so is his daughter. Astonishing. I mean, they've all been, they're all American paratroopers who have been on operations. It's a family that have this will to throw themselves out of perfectly serviceable aeroplanes. Amazing. Anyway, but Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz are sensible people, and they will not come up with what security guarantees should look like.
So nobody knows.
Nobody knows. No.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Quite a lot of questions about Alaska. Why are Trump and Putin meeting in Alaska and not a neutral location?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one, when this summit was first mooted, the immediate thought was United Arab Emirates, somewhere in the Gulf, because that would be neutral. It has to be somewhere. And
Trump had met the leader of the UAE as well, hadn't he?
Exactly, yes.
So it seemed like all the stars were aligned.
Bin Zayed, yeah. And so there was that sense that they could go to the Gulf. There's a number of countries in the Gulf, and the UAE was quite close to Russian diplomacy in that respect. There aren't too many other countries that they could go to without the ICC, the International Criminal Court ruling, being important, because Trump is an indicted war criminal. And so if he went to a country that has signed up to the ICC, then that country is duty-bound to arrest him. It could have been in India. They've not signed up to the ICC. It could have been in some of the Gulf states. But actually, rather than go to a neutral state, I don't know whether it was the Russians who said, we'll come to you, or the Americans who said, how about having it here? And although Washington might seem a bit of a stretch in terms of giving Putin such a triumph, maybe Alaska is somehow, it's America, but it's not quite.
It's keeping him in the cold.
Exactly, in the cold, yeah, Central America. And as we say, I mean, the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia is only 3 miles wide at its narrowest point. And during the winter, it freezes. You can walk from one country to the other, from one continent to another. So there's a sort of a symbolic interest in doing that. But I have to say, I don't know whether it was the American idea or a Russian idea, but whoever put the idea forward thought, OK, that's good. And it's not neutral, but it is sufficiently interesting to allow both sides. I mean, Trump doesn't have to take his whole sort of circus to another country, which is hard to arrange at short notice, all the security that goes with it. He's in America, and Putin gets the respectability of coming onto American soil for the meeting.
And a question from James B. On that. Why won't Putin be arrested when he sets foot in American soil? We already talked about the International Criminal Court. He says, I know there's no legal obligation for America to do so, but surely there's a moral one.
Well, you might think so. you would think so, wouldn't you? But that's the fact. The International Criminal Court, there are last time I looked, there were 125 members. But who is not a member? So the big four are not members. So America, Russia, China, and India. And those are the big four countries in the world, the biggest four, the countries that make the weather, the political weather for everybody else: America, Russia, China, and India. So none of them are members. I mean, Israel isn't a member, for reasons that you can imagine. A number of countries. I mean, there are 195 members of the General Assembly of the United Nations and 125 members of the ICC. So that's 70 countries in the world are not members of the ICC. But if you are a member, you're duty-bound to arrest any indicted war criminal. So, is there a moral duty? Well, yes, it would be nice if there were. But remember, the ICC only goes back to 2002, so it's quite recent. And it takes generations for these institutions to become really important in world politics. And the ICC is very controversial these days, but it's building a reputation for itself. And more countries would rather have it than not have it for all sorts of reasons. So, so the answer is no, they won't arrest him. And yes, they should, but no, they won't. So
no consequences for him when he lands.
No.
A few questions about the territory itself and what happens to the actual what's going on the ground. Mark J. has got in touch from Australia, actually. Mark, well done. Is whatever Trump agrees with Putin likely to be imposed on Ukraine? Would it have to be imposed on Ukraine? Or could Ukraine, perhaps with Europe's backing, just go it alone and continue fighting with Russia?
Yes, it could. Yes, it could. And that's one of the sort of points of leverage that Ukraine does have and that the Europeans do have. I mean, they don't have a whole lot of leverage over what's going on in Alaska at the weekend. But one of the points of leverage is that because the Europeans have now stepped up to support Ukraine, not all of them. I mean, Hungary is out of it because Orban is a sort of Putin puppet in effect, and so is Fico in Slovakia. So it's not all the Europeans, and Spain doesn't want to get involved in it because of all sorts of reasons. Italy has got a sort of ambiguous attitude. But Britain, France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic states, Denmark, Netherlands, the northern group of countries have taken a very tough view. They've said that we will back Ukraine, unshakably for as long as it takes, though that's all gets a bit vague. But the fact is, the Ukrainians now know, and they wouldn't have known this necessarily 18 months ago, even a year ago, that if they have to go it alone without America, they could. They could. It won't be easy, but the Europeans are now providing enough support. It is ramping up. So the Ukrainians are now producing about 40% of their own weapons. The Europeans are providing the other 40%, another 40%. The Americans are providing 20%, and that 20% is getting smaller and smaller as the American package that Joe Biden negotiated before he left office runs down and comes to an end pretty soon. And so, in a way, the Ukrainians could carry on without America. What they still really need is partly those few weapons that the Americans do provide are the very sophisticated ones that make a difference. And secondly, intelligence support, particularly with targeting, and Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink, which is fundamental to the ability of the Ukrainians to actually run their command and control system. And Elon Musk could turn it off in an instant if he chose to. He already has twice. He says not, but he has. And without Starlink, the Ukrainians find it much more difficult to operate. So the answer is they can continue to operate without American support as long as the Europeans stick with them. And enough of the big European countries have said that they intend to. And in this very interesting study that the Financial Times have produced only this week, looking at the way in which European armaments have ramped up in the last 12 months. And they say there's a real structural change going on in the rearmament of Europe. And that Europe is now producing at least 30% more weapons than it was producing just over a year ago. And it's going to produce a lot more soon. I mean, it's not fast enough. But there really is a big change on the European front in terms of preparing the sort of weapons that we think we might need now for the next 10 or 20 years. And Ukraine will get some of the benefit of that.
But there's also the political element to that, is if Russia and America come up with a deal and Trump thinks he's solved the war in Ukraine and Europe says, well, no, we're going to keep arming Ukraine, that's going to put a great big political gulf between Europe and America.
Yeah,
which,
that's right. And that's the big one, Jane.
Won't want
I mean, that's
either,
a really important point because, as I keep saying, the Europeans, if they carry on with this policy, the Europeans are going to have to be a lot braver than they've been so far because exactly that. If America says, well, we're washing our hands of it, and the Ukraine will just have to do whatever it can against the Russians, we're not going to help. And if you Europeans want to help, well, that's up to you, but don't expect us to be part of it. And that puts a wedge in the transatlantic relationship. And of course, that's exactly what the Russians have wanted. I mean, I would say that the danger is, now, again, we haven't arrived at this point yet, but the danger is that Trump hands on a plate to Putin a strategic advantage that no other Russian leader has had since the end of the Second World War. That Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Gorbachev, they dreamed of the idea that they could split the United States from the European allies, and they never could. I mean, previous American presidents were prepared to go to war not to split the allies. And the danger is that Trump's now going to hand it to them on a plate. It's not that bad yet, but if this summit is mishandled, and if the Europeans mishandle their response, then it could get that bad. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why in the run-up to this summit at the weekend, our European friends are being quite vocal about what they think should happen. I mean, Germany and France and Zelenskyy and Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy leader, foreign policy chief, they've all said things. Britain hasn't said anything. I mean, Starmer is keeping very quiet because Jonathan Powell, who's foreign policy advisor in Downing Street, is working behind the scenes very, very hard, and he's very well respected. So there's a sort of clash of cultures here. The British are trying to do this without going public, and our European partners are going pretty public on what they think are important issues. And we'll see. But the danger of a transatlantic split as a result of what happens at the weekend is not trivial anymore.
No. It feels very real, doesn't it? So the danger of the transatlantic split, but also the danger of the precedent it would set also for Russia. If Russia was told that it could retain some of this territory it's gained illegally, get real asks, doesn't that set a dangerous precedent for any large country to take what land it wants from its neighbours? And I suppose it does, doesn't
Of course,
it?
yeah. It's the might is right. And, I think I've said before, that we're living in a new imperialist age. And all the big powers now have got an imperialist mindset. So Russia is very imperialist. China is imperialist in East Asia. And the United States is imperialist under Trump in relation to Canada and Greenland and Panama and all these things that Trump says should be part of the American orbit. We live in a new imperialist age, and it'd be very, very difficult if land that was just conquered was somehow legally transferred. But again, that's not exactly what's going to happen. There's a big difference between recognizing, for the sake of a ceasefire, recognizing that you can't get a piece of territory back and giving up legal right to it. And so there's lots of examples in the world of countries that have lost territories in reality, but they've never given up the legal right to it. And so, for instance, Cyprus. Northern Cyprus was invaded, Cyprus was invaded by Turkey in 1974, and there's now a Republic of Northern Cyprus, which only Turkey recognises. Nobody else does, not even the United States. Nobody recognises Northern Cyprus. Now, the official Cypriot government, they know that they can't get Northern Cyprus back for the foreseeable future, but they haven't given up their claim to it. Same with Japan. The Kuril Islands. When the Russians invaded in 1945, they took all of the Kuril Islands. The southern four are Japanese. That's what the Japanese call their northern territory. So the Japanese know they can't get them back for the foreseeable future, but they've not given up their legal claim. And if in the fullness of time the Russian Federation cracks up in 80 or 150 years, the Japanese are entitled to say it's time to address our northern territories issue. So these things, do happen. There are territories in the world which are, as were given up de facto, but they're not given up legally, nor should they be.
And remain disputed. We've got about 15, 20 minutes to go. So if you do want to get a question in, do scan the QR code on your screen right now to join in live. We're getting quite a lot of questions coming in. Looking ahead to what could happen next, what could happen after Friday, Tess Canisville said, is there any realistic security guarantee that could stop Putin launching another ground invasion down the line? So I suppose if they are able to reach terms of some kind of agreement, and it is then agreed by Ukraine, what's to stop Putin doing it all again in 6 months' time?
Yeah, there's nothing you could put on paper that would make a difference. I think that's fairly clear. NATO membership would make a difference, but that's not going to happen. The Russians have said that there'd be a war.
For Ukraine, if NATO welcomed Ukraine.
Exactly, yeah. If NATO took in Ukraine. But that would be a quite an important security guarantee. But NATO nations aren't prepared to do that. America, who is still a very important member of NATO, has said that they forget about it. We would never agree, and therefore it's off the table. So that's not going to happen anyway. The thing that would most guarantee Ukraine is actually delivery of a lot of weapon systems so they can arm themselves. Ukraine is facing a future where for the next 2 or 3 generations, so let's say to the end of this century, it will have to live in an armed peace with its neighbour. They often say it'll be the Israel of Europe. It'll be a heavily armed country surrounded at least on one side by a hostile neighbour who's bigger than it. And so, therefore, it will arm itself. And that's the only guarantee that is practical, actually. If NATO membership is off the table for the next, let's say, 10 or 20 years, then what Ukraine needs, in whatever outcome we might envisage this year, next year, the year after, is a very heavily armed peace where they can defend themselves. They can make themselves into a porcupine. That's what the Finns used to do. Finland, of course, was right next to Russia at the end in 1945, and it had to live next to Russia, a massive country that had already invaded it once in 1940 and taken some of its territory. And the Finns created a porcupine strategy, which is to say, look, we know if you invade us with everything you've got, then you will take us all. But actually, we can make it sufficiently difficult for you to actually dissuade you, to make it just difficult. We'd be a porcupine. It'd be like swallowing a porcupine if you tried to swallow us up. And that's the best that the Ukrainians can do, is make themselves into a heavily armed porcupine so that the Russians think twice about whether to really try to take the rest of Ukraine. We know that that's what Putin wants. He's made no secret about that for the last 20-odd years. And so the Ukrainians have got a job on their hands, and so has Europe, because it matters. It's not just Ukraine, it matters to all of us, that somehow this situation is resolved. And the best resolution is going to be an armed peace, pending some sort of political resolution in the fullness of time, whenever that is.
And this peace that potentially could come, T.H. Rake asks, surely any ceasefire deal would merely be a chance for Putin and Russia to rebuild their economic and military strength. How long would it take? I mean, they've lost so many bodies on the battlefield, haven't they?
They have, yeah.
A pause, would that be enormously strategically useful for Russia?
Yeah, it would. The people in my business are talking about this all the time. I mean, how does Russia reconstitute its ground forces? Its air force is in pretty good shape because they haven't committed most of the air force to Ukraine, partly because they're frightened of losing it against NATO, because NATO air forces are actually very powerful compared to the Russian air force. So they haven't really committed the air force. Their navy, they've still got the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, which are still in being and still quite powerful. And so that hasn't changed very much. The strategic rocket forces have been modernized. What they've expended in Ukraine are the ground forces. So how long would it take to reconstitute those ground forces? And depending on what sort of standard you set for it, opinions range from 2 to 3 years to 5 to 6 years, but it's not 10 or 15 years. And the view is that if Putin gets a break from Ukraine, say till the end of the Trump administration, say that there was some sort of ceasefire were agreed this year, and Putin thinks, I'll stick to that ceasefire while Trump is in office, so as not to embarrass him, so as in order to develop my other strategic interests with the United States.
And that'll work nicely for Trump, who's desperate to get his
So
Nobel Peace
I can do
Prize,
him a
isn't he?
favour by observing the ceasefire for another 3 years. And in that 3 years, the ground forces could be really quite considerable again. That's the view of the Europeans, certainly the Baltic states and Finland and Sweden. Their analyses are pretty, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but they're pretty hard-nosed about the time it would take. Because Russia is already a war economy. It's a functioning war economy. And although it's straining the rest of the Russian economy, you can't turn a war economy off very easily. You just can't do it. I mean, the war economy keeps on running, keeps on producing all this stuff. Equally, I mean, the Russians are now developing an army of 1.3 million troops. They've got 700,000 to 800,000 in Ukraine. Remember, they started with 200,000 in Ukraine when they first invaded. They've now got 700,000 to 800,000. If the war stops, if those troops just go home, they'll be a real nuisance. They'll cause enormous problems. I mean, the one thing you don't want is the rapid demobilization of troops who've come out of a brutal war. We all know from lots of historical examples that tends to become a real domestic problem. So the tendency will be to modernize the forces and give them things to do, give them preparations to make, give them objectives to achieve. And so the general view in Europe, rightly or wrongly, is that if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, then the Russian military pressure on other European states will continue and will keep on growing. So the conclusion is that the European states have no choice but to rearm to deter the Russians from, as it were, continuing this sense of momentum that they've built up in order to fight this particular war.
And in terms of them rearming, what about Britain? Keo asks, do you see a world where British foot soldiers are required on the ground to enforce these new territorial boundaries? You're shaking your head. How big a risk would it be that's setting up a direct conflict between Britain and Russia?
Well, anything that Britain does to help Ukraine risks a direct conflict with Russia of sorts. And the Russians lose no opportunity to try to frighten us by talking about it. I mean, they regard Britain as their biggest enemy within Europe. I mean, they know that, they've got a relationship with America, but they really dislike Britain. And they regard Britain as somehow the ringleader of anti-Russian feelings in Europe. I mean, in a way, we are the political ringleader. But believe me, if you want anti-Russian feelings, talk to the Poles, talk to the Finns, talk to some of the Germans. They know what anti-Russian feeling really is, and they would know what fear of Russian militarism is. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which every time we make a gesture, the Russians try to frighten us with arguments about the danger of nuclear war and that Britain is in the crosshairs. And there's some truth to that. But no, I mean, our troops, we don't have enough to do anything meaningful within such a big country as Ukraine. With our army of 70-odd thousand, I mean, we are acting as a strategic reserve to NATO. And that depends on some of our special forces, our specialist forces, our air force and our navy. I mean, we're not in the front line of NATO anymore. The big countries in NATO in terms of troops are Germany and Poland and Finland. These are the countries that can put lots of troops into the field. And we will be, I mean, they're the ones that need to, as it would, take on the big war task, with Britain acting as a strategic reserve to do useful things, maybe vital things, in small areas of the front. That's the way we currently conceive of our role within NATO. Could we be involved in an air operation over Ukraine. That's plausible. Say there were an air policing force, a NATO air policing force, then the Royal Air Force could do some useful stuff there, and we've got some high-end capabilities. But again, that would be dangerous. The Russians say, if we see any NATO aircraft above Ukraine, then we'll regard that as an act of war. They've got no right to say that. I mean, they've got North Korean troops in Russia, and somehow the world's supposed to be relaxed about that, but Ukraine's not allowed to have its friends help it defend itself. But if Britain were to do something, it would be, I suspect, in the air environment, and certainly not in the ground environment.
Okay, so no British troops on the ground.
No, I think I can say definitely no British troops on the ground in Ukraine. and you know, who would they? I mean, where would we get them, for heaven's sake?
Where do we even start? So we've talked about what's happened over the last few days, what's going to happen on Friday, what if we get a peace deal? What if they don't get a peace deal? What if a ceasefire isn't agreed? Vincent LP asks, how likely do you consider Ukrainian forces collapsing, similar to the collapse of the German lines at the end of World War I? He sees parallels with it, he says, heavy trench warfare for years at a time until a sudden massive breakthrough. Do you think the Ukrainian forces could collapse?
It's always plausible. I mean, the German forces, actually a very interesting parallel that in 1918. The German forces didn't collapse. There was this famous, the Ludendorff offensive, the German offensive into Allied lines, which ran out of steam. And then the Allies came storming back and pushed the Germans right back out of the trench lines into the green fields beyond. And, the Germans could have gone again in 1918. They could have reorganized and come back again. But the reason they didn't is that their morale failed because they could see all the Americans arriving in Europe. The Americans didn't actually play a big role in 1918, despite what they say. They actually didn't play that big a role in that final offensive. There weren't enough of them. But the ordinary German soldiers could see that 1 million Americans would arrive, 2 million Americans arrived. And that took the morale, it took the guts out of the German army. So although they could have reorganized and come back and gone again, they just didn't, because that's what happened. Now, would that happen to Ukraine? I don't think it would. The Ukrainians, a bit like the Russians, they're a bit like a sponge. I mean, you can push into them and you can take areas, but the sponge will keep reconstituting itself. And although the Ukrainians are short on numbers, I don't think they'll crack. And that's not been the way this war has gone. I mean, could be wrong about that, but neither will the Russians. They won't crack either in that way. But it's like two sponges sort of, contesting against each other. But one sponge is much bigger than the other. And the other sponge, the smaller sponge, Ukraine, is trying to make a difference in the technological sphere by outthinking the Russians, by having better tactics and having some of the cutting-edge technologies, which they are getting in greater numbers from their West European friends.
Okay, not long to go. So final question, and this is from Harry. He says, in 10 years' time, it's quite a gloomy question, do you think an independent Ukraine will continue to exist?
I hope so. I mean, I more than hope so. Yes, I think so. I don't think...
Don't sound very sure.
No, I'm not. I mean, wars are very unpredictable things, and it's easy for us to sit here and talk about it.
Exactly.
We're not doing the fighting. We're not suffering. We're not losing members of our family and so on. And there comes a point at which sometimes societies just say, "I've had enough. I want to live under any circumstances, rather than keep on fighting in an endless war." But I think that so far the Ukrainians seem to indicate, and opinion in Ukraine seems to lean towards the idea that they will keep fighting if there is no alternative. I mean, living under Russian control, they know what it feels like already. They know what Russian control is in the 20%, almost 20% of Ukraine that the Russians have taken. And they don't want that. They absolutely don't want it. And when the Russians in 2022 had this belief, astonishingly poor intelligence, that somehow they'd been welcomed in by the Russian speakers. And it was a real shock, I think, to the Russian establishment that they weren't. And everything that's happened since 2022 has reinforced the Ukrainian sense that they really are fighting for life, and that life under Russian occupation, Russian control, would be absolutely intolerable. And for that reason, I think that they will keep going. Another 10 years? Yeah, I think they will. I think there'll be a ceasefire before then, which will last for a little while, then break down. So we're in the second Ukraine-Russian war at the moment. I think there'll be a third, maybe a fourth, punctuated by ceasefires, and we'll see where that takes us. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are doing what the British were doing in the 1940s. You're hanging on. You hang on and hope that the geopolitical wheel keeps turning eventually to your advantage. It may not. It may turn to your disadvantage, but you never know.
It does feel, though, this week that the wheels are really turning quite significantly.
They are, yeah. Sometimes, these geopolitical wheels, they turn slowly sometimes. And then occasionally, it's like a catastrophe wheel. It's like having a piece of elastic attached to it. It suddenly switches. And a small event suddenly brings the wheel, halfway round the dial again. And it's one of the weeks in which I think that may happen. And so by this time next week, we might be talking about a situation which is extremely fluid and very dynamic, politically as well as militarily.
Michael, thanks so much. It's been really interesting. And all eyes will be on what happens on Friday. Don't forget, if you joined us partway through and you want to watch back, you can watch the Q&A back on demand. And Michael will be back next week to answer all your questions and to give you all the lowdown on what happened in Alaska. Thanks a lot, Michael.